The war did not begin with tanks rolling across borders or bombs falling from the sky. It began in the minds of two men who never met on the battlefield, yet whose thoughts, words, and wills collided with enough force to reshape the 20th century. In the early hours of May 1940, as German armies tore through Europe with terrifying speed, one man stood at the peak of absolute power in Berlin, convinced history had chosen him as its instrument. At that same moment in London, another man, older, isolated, and widely doubted, took office with nothing to offer his people but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. Adolf Hitler and Winston Churchill were about to wage a war not only of weapons, but of minds, ideology, and psychological endurance. Hitler's rise was rooted in humiliation and rage. The shattered Germany of the post-World War I era was fertile ground for a man who spoke in absolutes and promised rebirth through domination. Hitler believed himself guided by destiny, immune to compromise, and empowered by a ruthless clarity of purpose. His decisions were driven not by balance or restraint, but by obsession, racial purity, territorial expansion, and personal vindication. Each success reinforced his belief that boldness alone could bend reality. Austria fell. Czechoslovakia was dismantled. Poland was crushed in weeks. To Hitler, hesitation was weakness, and negotiation was surrender. Churchill stood in stark contrast. He was no stranger to failure. He carried the scars of political misjudgments and military disasters, and many in Britain considered him a relic of the past. Yet his mind was shaped by a deep understanding of history's cycles, how tyrants rise, how democracies falter, and how moral surrender often precedes physical defeat. Churchill saw Hitler not merely as a German leader, but as an embodiment of a dangerous idea, that force alone could redefine truth. While others sought compromise, Churchill understood that appeasement fed ambition rather than calming it. The psychological battle reached its first climax in 1940. Hitler expected Britain to negotiate after France collapsed. His worldview could not comprehend defiance from an outnumbered island. Churchill's refusal shattered Hitler's assumptions. The Battle of Britain was not only an air campaign, it was a duel of belief. Hitler relied on terror from above, convinced fear would break civilian morale. Churchill answered with words that transformed fear into resolve. Each German bomb that fell hardened British resistance, turning cities into symbols of endurance rather than submission. Hitler's mind began to fracture under contradiction. He demanded absolute loyalty, yet trusted no one. He micromanaged generals while dismissing their warnings. His ideological rigidity blinded him to logistical reality, most disastrously in his decision to invade the Soviet Union in 1941. This was not merely a strategic gamble, it was psychological overreach. Hitler believed willpower could conquer geography, climate, and human limits. Churchill, watching from afar, recognized the turning of the tide. The war Hitler had unleashed was now larger than his control. As the conflict expanded, the human cost became immeasurable. Hitler's decisions unleashed industrialized death. Cities erased, nations enslaved, millions murdered in the name of racial fantasy. His inability to accept failure prolonged suffering on a global scale. Churchill, too, bore responsibility for brutal choices, yet his decisions were shaped by survival rather than domination. He understood that leadership in war demanded sacrifice without surrendering moral direction. By 1945, the contrast was complete. Hitler retreated into isolation, clinging to delusion as the world he sought to command collapsed around him. Churchill stood among the victors, aware that triumph came at a terrible cost, and that peace would demand vigilance rather than celebration. One mind consumed by absolute power ended in ruin. The other, tempered by doubt and historical memory, helped preserve a fragile freedom. This war of minds leaves a final warning echoing through history. When ideology replaces humanity, intelligence becomes cruelty. When leaders believe themselves chosen by destiny, they cease to hear reality. The clash between Hitler and Churchill reminds us that the greatest battles are often fought long before the first shot is fired. In the beliefs we tolerate, the lies we excuse, and the courage we demand when silence feels safer than resistance. The war that would consume half the world did not begin with gunfire or explosions. It began inside two very different minds, shaped by fear, memory, ambition, and belief. One believed history was a weapon meant to be wielded through domination. The other believed history was a warning, whispering what happens when tyranny is allowed to grow unchecked. Adolf Hitler and Winston Churchill never faced each other across a battlefield, yet their conflict became one of the most decisive psychological duels of the modern age. It was a war of willpower, imagination, and ideology, a war of minds that changed the 20th century forever. Adolf Hitler emerged from the wreckage of Germany after the First World War, a nation humiliated by defeat and strangled by economic collapse. To millions of Germans, he did not speak as a politician, but as a prophet of revenge. Hitler's personality was defined by absolutes. He divided the world into enemies and allies, strength and weakness, purity and decay. Compromise was, to him, a form of betrayal. He believed destiny had chosen him to restore German greatness, and every early success reinforced this dangerous conviction. The annexation of Austria, the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia, and the rapid conquest of Poland seemed to confirm that boldness and brutality could bend the world to his will. Across the English Channel, Winston Churchill watched with growing alarm. Unlike Hitler, Churchill was haunted by memory. He had lived through the First World War and understood how quickly civilization could unravel. He saw in Hitler not just a German nationalist, but a revolutionary tyrant driven by ideology rather than reason. While many leaders hoped accommodation might preserve peace, Churchill recognized a pattern history had shown before: unchecked ambition only grows stronger when rewarded. His warnings were dismissed as alarmist, his reputation damaged by past failures. Yet when Britain stood alone in 1940, it was this deeply flawed, stubborn man who became its voice. The fall of France marked a turning point in the psychological war. Hitler expected Britain to negotiate. His worldview could not accept defiance from a nation he considered militarily inferior and strategically isolated. He believed fear was decisive, that terror from the air would shatter civilian morale and force surrender. Churchill understood the opposite. He knew that fear, if met with purpose, could become resolve. As German bombs fell on British cities, Churchill's words transformed suffering into meaning. The Blitz became not a symbol of terror, but of endurance. Hitler underestimated something he could not measure: the moral resistance of a society that refused to submit. This miscalculation exposed a fatal weakness in Hitler's mind. He was incapable of imagining resistance unless it was irrational or conspiratorial. Those who opposed him were not strategic adversaries, but obstacles to be crushed. As the war widened, Hitler increasingly centralized power, distrusting generals and overriding expertise with instinct. His belief in his own infallibility hardened into delusion. Each decision became more reckless, driven by ideology rather than reality. The invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 was not merely a military gamble. It was the climax of Hitler's psychological arrogance. He believed willpower and racial superiority could overcome distance, climate, and human endurance. Churchill, observing this moment, understood its significance. He recognized that Hitler had opened a war he could not control. Unlike Hitler, Churchill did not believe history was predetermined by destiny. He believed it was shaped by choices, restraint, and alliances. He reached out to former enemies, understanding that survival demanded cooperation rather than purity. Urged dissent and moved through terror. Churchill tolerated Churchill amplified it, believing an informed population was stronger than a frightened one. By 1945, the psychological duel reached its end. Hitler retreated into isolation, surrounded by ruins and fantasies, issuing orders to armies that no longer existed. His belief in destiny collapsed into nihilism. The man who had sought to dominate history became consumed by it. Churchill stood among the victors, not triumphant but reflective, aware that peace would bring new challenges and that freedom was never permanent. His victory was not the defeat of Germany, but the defeat of an idea that fear and domination could replace human dignity. This war of minds offers a lasting warning. When leaders believe themselves chosen by destiny, they stop listening to reality. When ideology replaces humanity, intelligence becomes cruelty. The clash between Hitler and Churchill reminds us that the greatest dangers often begin quietly, inside beliefs left unchallenged and ambitions left unchecked. History does not repeat itself by accident. It returns when power forgets humility, when fear silences conscience, and when people mistake strength for domination. The echoes of this conflict remain, asking the same question of every generation when faced with tyranny. Will we surrender to fear, or will we endure? Unchecked ambition was the engine that powered Adolf Hitler's rise and ultimately guaranteed his collapse. From the moment he entered politics, ambition was not me. Rely a personal trait. It became a worldview. Hitler did not seek power to govern within limits or to correct specific injustices. He sought power to dominate history itself. He believed nations existed to be conquered, people to be classified, and reality to be reshaped by will alone. This mindset brought early victories that stunned the world, but it also planted the seeds of catastrophic failure, because ambition without restraint inevitably turns against itself. In the early 1930s, Hitler's ambition found a nation weakened by defeat and desperate for meaning. Germany's humiliation after the First World War, combined with economic collapse and political chaos, created an opening for a leader who promised certainty. Hitler offered simple answers to complex problems. He did not speak of compromise or reform, but of rebirth through struggle. His ambition was framed as destiny. He portrayed himself as the instrument through which Germany would reclaim its stolen greatness, and this belief soon hardened into absolute conviction. Every opponent became an enemy of the nation. Every obstacle became proof that greater force was required. Once in power, Hitler moved quickly to eliminate constraints. Democratic institutions were dismantled, rivals were purged, and loyalty was enforced through fear. These actions were not defensive. They were expressions of ambition. Hitler did not merely want to rule Germany. He wanted to remake it according to his ideological vision. Early successes seemed to justify his methods. The reoccupation of the Rhineland met no resistance. Austria was annexed without war. Western powers hesitated, hoping appeasement would preserve peace. To Hitler, this hesitation was not diplomacy, it was weakness. Each concession confirmed his belief that boldness was unstoppable. This pattern continued with the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia and the invasion of Poland. Blitzkrieg tactics delivered rapid victories, reinforcing Hitler's sense of invincibility. His confidence evolved into contempt for caution. Military expertise was tolerated only when it aligned with his instincts. Generals who warned of logistical limits or long-term risks were dismissed or overruled. Ambition demanded constant expansion because stagnation felt like betrayal of destiny. Hitler could not pause, consolidate, or reconsider because his identity was bound to perpetual conquest. Yet ambition that ignores reality does not remain powerful. It becomes reckless. The decision to invade the Soviet Union in 1941 marked a decisive turning point. This was not a strategic necessity, it was ideological obsession. Hitler believed racial hierarchy and willpower could overcome geography, climate, and numbers. He underestimated Soviet resilience and overestimated his own capacity to control a multi-front war. This decision shattered the balance of the conflict. Germany now faced a war of attrition it could not sustain, draining resources, manpower, and morale. As pressure mounted, Hitler's ambition mutated into denial. Rather than adapt, he doubled down. Retreat was forbidden. Negotiation was treason. Reality itself became the enemy. He centralized command, micromanaging operations from afar, issuing impossible orders to exhausted armies. His ambition no longer sought victory, it sought validation. To admit error would mean admitting that destiny had limits. Instead, Germany was sacrificed to preserve Hitler's illusion of infallibility. The consequences were devastating. Cities were destroyed, civilian populations suffered immense hardship, and millions died because ambition refused to yield to reason. Hitler's ideological rigidity prolonged the war long after defeat was inevitable. His inability to accept failure ensured maximum destruction, not only for Germany's enemies, but for Germany itself. What began as a promise of national rebirth ended in total collapse, moral ruin, and physical annihilation. Unchecked ambition in Hitler's case was both his weapon and his weakness. It propelled him upward in a world unprepared to confront his ruthlessness, but it also blinded him to limits that no leader can escape. History shows that ambition divorced from humility and restraint does not create lasting power, it accelerates destruction. Hitler's rise and fall stand as a stark reminder that success achieved through domination carries within it the certainty of ruin, and that when ambition becomes absolute, it consumes everything in its path, including the one who wields it. Winston Churchill's greatest weapon was not an army, a fleet, or an air force. It was his understanding of history and the human spirit, and his ability to turn fear into resolve at a moment when collapse seemed inevitable. When he became Prime Minister in May 1940, Britain stood on the edge of disaster. France was falling, the British Army had barely escaped annihilation at Dunkirk, and much of Europe lay under Nazi control. Fear was everywhere, in Parliament, in the streets, and in the minds of ordinary citizens who believed invasion was only days away. Churchill did not deny this fear. He confronted it, shaped it, and transformed it into determination. Unlike Hitler, who saw fear as a tool to dominate others, Churchill understood fear as a natural human response that could be redirected. His deep knowledge of history told him that societies do not collapse simply because they are attacked. They collapse when they lose faith in themselves. Churchill believed morale was as decisive as firepower. He recognized that Britain's survival depended not only on military resistance, but on psychological endurance. The population needed a reason to endure suffering without surrendering its values. Churchill's speeches were not empty rhetoric. They were carefully constructed acts of leadership. He did not promise quick victory or painless success. Instead, he acknowledged the darkness ahead. By openly admitting the scale of danger, he earned trust. When he spoke of blood, toil, tears, and sweat, he was not glorifying sacrifice. He was preparing the nation for reality. In doing so, he removed the paralyzing power of uncertainty. Fear thrives in silence and denial. Churchill destroyed it by naming it. During the Battle of Britain, this transformation became visible. German bombers targeted cities, factories, and civilian neighborhoods in an attempt to break morale. Hitler believed terror would force submission. Churchill understood that terror, if framed correctly, could achieve the opposite. Each bombing raid became a shared national experience, rather than an isolated tragedy. Suffering was no longer meaningless, it became part of a collective struggle. Churchill's words gave people a sense that endurance itself was a form of resistance. This psychological shift had profound consequences. Civilians continued working in bombed factories. Pilots returned to the skies despite overwhelming odds. Britain refused to negotiate, even when defeat appeared logical. Churchill's leadership replaced fear of death with fear of dishonor, fear of occupation, and fear of surrendering the future. He appealed not to hatred, but to identity, who the British believed themselves to be and who they refused to become. Churchill's understanding of history also guided his strategic patience. He knew Britain could not defeat Nazi Germany alone in 1940. His goal was survival, not immediate victory. By sustaining morale, he preserved time, the most valuable resource in war. Time allowed alliances to form, resources to mobilize, and enemies to overextend. Hitler underestimated this entirely. He saw refusal to surrender as irrational defiance, not strategic endurance. Even within government, Churchill faced dissent and doubt. Some ministers favored negotiation, believing resistance was futile. Churchill did not silence them through fear or purges. He argued, persuaded, and stood firm. This tolerance for disagreement strengthened his position. It demonstrated confidence rather than insecurity. Where Hitler ruled through terror and demanded obedience, Churchill led through conviction and accountability. The human cost of this resolve was immense. Cities burned, families were torn apart, loss became routine, yet Britain did not break. Churchill's leadership gave suffering a purpose beyond survival. It connected it to the defense of principles larger than the moment. Freedom, self-determination, and resistance to tyranny became ideas worth enduring hardship for. These ideas outlasted fear. Churchill's transformation of fear into resolve altered the course of the war. By refusing surrender, he denied Hitler a decisive victory in the West. By sustaining morale, he kept Britain alive long enough for the United States and the Soviet Union to enter the conflict. What seemed like stubborn defiance became a strategic turning point. The war Hitler believed he could end through terror became a prolonged global struggle that ultimately destroyed his regime. This legacy extends beyond the Second World War. Churchill demonstrated that leadership in crisis is not about eliminating fear, but about guiding it. Fear acknowledged becomes strength. Fear denied becomes collapse. His example reminds us that resilience is built not through promises of safety, but through honesty, meaning, and moral clarity. In moments when fear threatens to paralyze societies, Churchill's leadership stands as proof that resolve, once awakened, can outlast even the darkest storms. The Second World War revealed with brutal clarity how decisions made in the minds of leaders can magnify human suffering on an unimaginable scale. Every order issued, every strategy approved, and every refusal to retreat carried consequences that rippled far beyond battlefields, reaching into homes, cities, and entire generations. Nowhere was this more evident than in the contrast between Adolf Hitler's ideologically driven command and the wider human cost that followed. The war became not only a clash of nations, but a demonstration of how unchecked authority and distorted belief can turn human lives into expendable instruments. Hitler's approach to war was rooted in dehumanization. He viewed populations not as individuals but as categories, useful, inferior, or disposable. This mindset removed moral restraint from decision-making. Cities were bombed without regard for civilian life. Entire communities were uprooted in the name of racial engineering. Military setbacks were met not with adaptation, but with punishment. When armies failed, Hitler blamed betrayal rather than strategy, condemning soldiers and civilians alike to suffer for his refusal to acknowledge error. This psychological framework produced cascading consequences. The insistence on fighting to the last man prolonged conflicts that could have ended earlier. Retreats were forbidden even when encirclement was inevitable. Supply lines collapsed, troops froze and starved, and casualties mounted because ambition overruled reality. The Eastern Front became a vast graveyard, not only due to combat, but because decisions ignored human limits. Millions of soldiers and civilians were consumed by a war that no longer served strategic purpose. Only ideological pride. Beyond the battlefield, the suffering reached its darkest form in the systematic annihilation of civilians. The Holocaust was an OT byproduct of war. It was a direct outcome of ideological obsession translated into policy. Bureaucratic efficiency was applied to murder. Trains, camps, and quotas transformed hatred into routine administration. These decisions did not arise from chaos, but from deliberate planning. They demonstrate how intellectual justifications can mask moral collapse, turning cruelty into normal procedure. The psychological impact extended to those forced to live under occupation. Fear became constant. Families disappeared overnight. Survival often required silence, compliance, or betrayal. Trust between neighbors eroded as regimes rewarded informants and punished dissent. These conditions fractured societies long after the fighting ended. Trauma did not stop with liberation. It lingered in memory, shaping generations who inherited loss, displacement, and grief. Even within Germany, the consequences were devastating. As defeat loomed, Hitler's refusal to accept reality led to total destruction. Cities were defended to the point of annihilation. Young boys and elderly men were sent into combat with no chance of survival. Infrastructure was destroyed not by enemies alone, but by orders that prioritized symbolic resistance over human life. The nation Hitler claimed to elevate was reduced to ruins, its people left to reckon with moral and physical devastation. The contrast with alternative leadership styles exposes the magnitude of these choices. Where leaders recognize limits, suffering can be mitigated. Where leaders adapt, lives can be preserved. Hitler's inability to do either ensured that suffering escalated rather than diminished. His war did not end when defeat became clear. It continued because ideology demanded it, regardless of cost. This chapter of history forces a sobering realization. Mass suffering is not accidental. It is produced through decisions repeated, nor normalized and defended by those in power. The human toll of the Second World War was not inevitable. It was shaped by choices that valued ideology over humanity and control over compassion. When leaders abandon moral responsibility, suffering becomes policy. And when that happens, entire civilizations pay the price. The legacy of this suffering remains a warning. Decisions made in isolation, driven by belief rather than evidence, can devastate millions who have no voice in the process. History shows that the greatest atrocities are not committed in moments of chaos, but in moments of certainty, when leaders are convinced they are right and humanity becomes secondary to ambition. History's most enduring warning is not written in treaties or carved into monuments. It lives in the ruins left behind when power is allowed to exist without moral restraint. The clash between Adolf Hitler and Winston Churchill ultimately exposes a universal truth. When power forgets humility and ideology replaces humanity, destruction becomes inevitable. This is not a lesson confined to the 20th century. It is a pattern that repeats whenever ambition silences conscience and certainty replaces doubt. Hitler's rise illustrates how dangerous power becomes when it is fused with ideological absolutism. He did not see leadership as responsibility, but as entitlement. His belief that he embodied the will of history removed all internal limits. Once a leader accepts the idea that he is chosen, disagreement becomes treason, compassion becomes weakness, and restraint becomes betrayal. In this mental framework, moral boundaries collapse. Violence is no longer a tragic necessity. It becomes a virtue. Suffering is no longer regrettable. It becomes proof of commitment to the cause. This transformation of belief into justification is what makes ideology so lethal. Ideology simplifies the world into rigid categories, stripping individuals of their humanity. When people are reduced to symbols, enemies, or obstacles, their suffering becomes invisible. Hitler did not wake each day intending to destroy millions as individuals. He acted within a system of belief that told him those lives did not matter. That is how power commits atrocities while convincing itself it is righteous. Churchill's resistance to this mindset was not based on moral perfection, but on moral awareness. He understood that power without humility leads to catastrophe. His leadership accepted uncertainty and acknowledged limits. He did not claim destiny or perfection, he claimed responsibility. This difference mattered. It allowed him to recognize error, tolerate dissent, and adapt to changing realities. Where Hitler demanded belief, Churchill demanded endurance. Where Hitler enforced silence, Churchill used truth as a weapon. The universal danger revealed by this contrast is not dictatorship alone, but certainty without accountability. The most destructive leaders are often those who believe they cannot be wrong. When power no longer listens, it begins to consume itself. Decisions become disconnected from human consequence. Warnings are dismissed. Reality is denied. At that point, collapse is no longer a possibility. It is a certainty waiting for time to catch up. History shows that societies rarely fall because they lack strength. They fall because they abandon moral judgment in exchange for comfort, fear, or blind loyalty. Hitler did not seize absolute power overnight. It was granted in stages, justified by crisis, normalized by silence, and protected by fear. This gradual surrender is what makes such systems possible. Tyranny thrives not only on cruelty, but on indifference. The final lesson of this war of minds is deeply unsettling because it places responsibility beyond leaders alone. It asks what people tolerate, excuse, or ignore. It asks how often security is valued over freedom and certainty over truth. Power becomes most dangerous when it is admired without question and followed without scrutiny. The ruins of the Second World War remind us that progress is fragile. Civilization is not permanently secured by technology or law, but by ethical vigilance. When ideology claims absolute authority and power forgets its limits, humanity becomes expendable. History does not warn gently, it warns through devastation. The story of Hitler and Churchill leaves us with a choice that every generation must face anew, whether to accept comforting illusions of strength or to defend uncomfortable truths, whether to obey power blindly or to challenge it responsibly. The past does not demand remembrance for its own sake. It demands awareness. Because when power stops listening to conscience, history does not forgive. It repeats.